Hey everybody, myth lovers, or just people who like stories. Welcome again to my channel. Halloween is almost upon us, so I thought I'd put together a little video of some scary myths and legends. Uh, and when I back in the '80s, when I really started getting into mythology, I had a subscription to a Time Life series of books called The Enchanted World, and they came in all these beautiful colors. But I knew that if I got a black one, it was going to be some scary stuff. So I have three here. There's Tales of Terror, and there's another one here, Ghosts, and finally another one here called Night Creatures. And so I put together a few stories from these books, as well as from this book here, which is Scandinavian folk tales by Jacqueline Simpson. I'll have these books mentioned below. So let me start out with a good old fashioned ghost story. One night there was this young couple sleeping in their bed in a little hut in a village, and they were very poor. And what happened is that the husband woke up, and he saw this little mist coming in through the keyhole of the house, and the mist kept coming in, and he looked on the floor and he noticed that the mist was sort of congealing into a little baby. But this was no ordinary baby. This baby was out for blood, and the baby climbed up the bed, and he crawled over to the sleeping wife, and he put his little baby hands on her eyes, and then the wife woke up screaming, and there was blood coming out of her eyes. The baby ghost had gouged out her eyes. You would say, why would a baby ghost do that? Well, it turns out that a lot of people who were very poor in olden times, and they couldn't afford to have to raise a baby, raise a kid. I don't know if these parents, if this husband and wife had already a kid or two, and they couldn't afford another one. What they did was that when they had a baby, this last infant, they abandoned it in the woods to get eaten by wild animals, and that's how they would dispose of unwanted infants. Sounds really terrible, but that's what some people did apparently back then. And so anyway, so this was a vengeful infant. This was their infant that they had abandoned in the woods, and so that's one ghost story. I told this story many years ago to my brother when we were living together in my parents' house. And he went down to the basement at first he didn't think much of the story, but then he went down to the basement to get up something. And I noticed that when he came back up the stairs, he was kind of running up the stairs like he had just seen a ghost. And I looked at him, I said, "The story got to you, didn't it?" And he goes, "Yeah." It's one of those stories that you think about and then it gives you the chills later on. But anyway, so from Night Creatures, I'll mention a few things about vampires, werewolves. I've touched on vampires and werewolves in previous videos, so we're all familiar with vampires and werewolves and trolls and stuff like that. Anyway, one interesting thing about vampires in modern movies, they seem, the vampires can't stand the light. They seem to burst into flames, but in a lot of these old stories, it's not that they burst into flames. They're weak. The sunlight seems to weaken them, and they can't protect themselves from anybody, and they have to quickly get to their coffin. Otherwise, somebody could decapitate them or burn them to ashes, and or put a stake through their heart. So what happens is that there's a story about a Russian Cossack who came across a vampire, and the two of them went walking to a church where, I don't know if it was a church, but they came across a wedding, and the vampire went to the bride, and took her hands and put his face on her hands as if he was supplicating her for some reason. But then when the vampire got up and walked away, the Cossack realized that the bride had fallen into a swoon. That's when he realized that this being wasn't. He thought he was just a regular human, and he ran up to him and he grabbed him by the arm, and the two of them got into a fight. And but then the two of them heard the cock crow, and so the vampire realized that dawn is coming. So he immediately left the Cossack and he ran away to get into his coffin. But the Cossack and the village people at the time realized that there was a vampire on the loose, and they all gathered around the coffin and they dragged him out of the coffin and they burned his body. But interestingly, while the body was burning away, there were all these creatures jumping out of the flames. Spiders and amphibians and reptiles and snakes and ravens and all kinds of birds and other things that are associated with the darkness. And they realized that every one of these creatures had to be killed because they contain. If one of them got away, it would contain the spirit of the vampire. Then the spirit can go ahead and invade another corpse and drink somebody else's blood. So they killed all of these noxious creatures that jumped out of the burning corpse. There's another. There's another night creature that I find very interesting. This is you've heard of incubi and succubi. These are demons that take the form of either male or female, so that they could harass people in their sleep and have sex with them. Usually if it's in the form of a man, supposedly demons don't have sex. I mean, they could have sex, but they don't have gender, supposedly. So when they want to disturb a sleeping woman, they take the form of a man, and sometimes this is called an incubus. And if a demon wants to assault a man in his sleep, that would be called the succubus. They would take the form of a woman, and sometimes these demonic beings were called Liliths, a Lilith. And what they do is that they, having sex while you're sleeping or half asleep doesn't sound too bad, but these stories are emanating from Christian Europe, so any kind of sex outside of marriage is not good. And not only that, they do worse than, have sex with you. They kind of drain you, and they take away your vitality. But in Scandinavia, they have an interesting version of the Lilith. She's called Amara, Mara. And in this book, Jacqueline Simpson goes through some detail about the birth of the Mara, how Mara's come into being. What supposedly in the Bible in Genesis, after Adam and Eve were kicked out of Eden because they sinned, that's when God said to Eve and all subsequent women, "You will bring forth children in more pain." Apparently, there was already pain involved in childbirth, but it's going to be increased because of the original sin. And what happens is that it was believed to be bad luck if a woman tried to do a ritual or to take some sort of medicine to prevent. Today we do it all the time, but back in the old days, in Middle Ages, when there wasn't modern medicine where they can give you today, they would do these little rituals that were like part of old wives' tale that were believed to take away the pain of childbirth. But it was believed to be sinful to do that because it was God's command that you're supposed to suffer during childbirth. And if a woman went ahead and tried to prevent pain from happening by doing some sort of folk ritual, if she gave birth to a boy, the boy would turn into a werewolf at night. If she gave birth to a girl, she would turn into a Mar at night. And a Mar is a woman who, well, she looks like a woman, but what happens is that at night she could take the form of a mist, of like a vapor, and she could go to any house, usually a house that has a single man in it, and she would find a tiny chink in the wall of his house, and she would, you know, get in as a vapor into the house, and take the form of a woman, and harass the sleeping man and cause nightmares. And there was this one man in Scandinavia who he was suffering from nightmares, and the village people realized that he was, as time was going on, he was getting weak looking. Uh, uh, he was getting uh, what's the other word? Yeah, weak looking, like hungry, like starved, and you know, rather sullen, and pale, and like his vitality was draining from him. So one night he happened to wake up while he was having a dream, and he noticed this little vapor coming in through this little chink in his house. And he saw the little finger-like tendrils of the vapor, and he had a suspicious feeling that this was a malevolent force. So what he did was that he had a candle with him, and he blocked up the chink in his house with wax. And he turned around and he saw that the vapor become this had become this woman, very pale looking, with black hair, and and he said well, you know, why don't you make yourself useful and become my wife? Maybe not so much because he was lonely, but a wife did certain duties for the husband. Like, he was a fisherman, so she would like mend the nets, maybe fix the clothes or cook, whatever. And but as more time went by with her as his wife, he wasn't getting better. He was getting worse. He was getting weaker with time, and she was stealing. She was still managing to steal his vitality from him, and he became an alcoholic. And every night would go by, and he would ask her, what are you, and where did you come from? And she would never answer. And it was a meeting of wills, but because her strength was strong at night, he was too busy being drunk, and she was the stronger of the two. She would never answer him. So one night he got fed up with her, and what he did was he opened up he took the wax out of the chink in his house, and she vaporized immediately and left with a wail. She left the house. Some married men would say, "Well, it doesn't take a Mara to steal a man's vitality. Isn't that the job of every wife?" I wouldn't know. I'm not married, so anyway, big surprise, right? Anyway, so I don't know. I just find the concept of the Mara very interesting. I don't know if they would be called a succubus exactly. This is more folk stories. I don't think they're demons. I think they're just cursed individuals because the mother tried to avoid pain in childbirth, and they became creatures of the night. The sons becoming werewolves, and women becoming Mars. And anyway, that story that's really told very well in this book, Scandinavian Folktales, the origin of Mars and werewolves. And anyway, so let me tell one more story. This is a story about it's called Israel, and I think in Tales of Terror, it's called In the Belly of the Beast. I think it's called. Let me look it up. Anyway, I'll look it up later, and I'll put it down. I'll put the title down below, and but it's definitely in this book, Tales of Terror. And it's a really amazing story. It's kind of scary, but it also teaches you things about kindness and patience, and no matter what situation you find yourself in, whether it's a very scary or horrifying situation. And basically, it's a Jewish story about this young man named Israel. And what it was is that he was in charge of taking care of these children in his village. And what he did was that there was a forest nearby, and what he did was that the parents of the kids didn't like the idea of any of their kids going into this forest. But Israel wanted to show these kids that the trees and the creatures living in the forest are part of God's creation too. So they're there for enjoyment and appreciation of God's work. So what he did was he led them into the woods, and they would even sing. The kids, he would lead them in prayer and song, but living in the woods, unfortunately, was this lonely woodsman who was living by himself. By day, he wouldn't bother anybody, but by night, he was obsessed and possessed by demons, and and what happens is that one night, these demons that were living inside this woodsman heard the singing of these children, and they got very angry and they wanted to put a stop to it. So they went to the boss himself. They went down to the devil, and the devil said, "I'll take care of this myself." And he visited the woodsman, and he tore out his heart, and he replaced his heart with his own heart to become as black as possible. So that night, as evening approached and the kids didn't leave the forest yet, the woodsman appeared, and with a great roar, he ran up to them, and the kids all ran all over the place, screaming, trying to get away, except for Israel. Now, he was older than the kids. He was a young man, maybe a teenager, and he stood his ground because he wasn't afraid. He knew he could handle whatever was approaching him head on. So the woodsman opened up his mouth to the size of a cavern, and Israel walked into this cavern that seemed to be a cavern into hell. The walls were blood spattered and built out of bone, and he kept walking, and he came across this tree made out of flesh, and hanging on this tree, one of the branches of this tree, was a beating heart, and he had heard this beating from the opening of the cavern, and he kept following it until he came across it, and what he did was that he didn't do anything rash. He didn't take the heart and throw it on the floor. But he knew that there was something evil about it. But he didn't run away. He pulled the heart off the tree, and he tried to listen to it. He put it up to his ear, and apart from the thumping of the heart, he tried to listen. And what he heard was pretty remarkable. In the midst of this evil heart, and this evil that this woodsman would become by being possessed by the devil and demons, he heard wailing and crying and sobbing. And he realized then that even in the midst of great evil, there's pain and suffering. So he kind of like cradled the heart, and he gently walked out of the mouth of the woodsman back outside, and a huge crack in the earth opened up, and the heart slipped out of his hand and went back down to hell, to the devil. And unfortunately, the kids never came with him again into the forest. So I find that to be a remarkable story. Creepy, but very interesting. Anyway, I hope you liked my Halloween video. Until next time, keep reading. Happy Halloween.